Yeah, gotcha. That wasn't on. Get that introduced. We've talked about it at some length before, so I'm not going to go into it in a whole lot of detail this morning. Obviously, we're going to have public hearings in front of Planning and Zoning and County Council. But as a brief overview, what it does is it pulls the buffer requirements out of the definition section of our subdivision ordinance and puts them in a new section within the subdivision ordinance. It also consolidates them as one set of standards for all buffers, whether it's just a regular subdivision or a cluster subdivision. So there's not two different types of buffers depending on what type of subdivision you're in. It also is more specific on the planning requirements and what to do if you have a situation where the buffer area is currently wooded versus a buffer area that is currently, just farmed or tilled or whatever, with the goal being to preserve the woodlands that are in that buffer area so that they stay there and they're protected throughout the development and life of the subdivision. And to that, in that regard, if it is a wooded area that is the buffer, we've added a perimeter buffer protection area of 20 feet beyond the 30-foot wide buffer so that the roots aren't grubbed and the trees aren't disturbed. And all that is marked with silt fencing, ribbons, and signage so that everybody all the time knows where this would be. The other thing it does, and we've heard from some folks along the way about timing, it improves this timing and schedule of the buffer planning. So if it's a new buffer, for example, that has to be, well, even if it's woodland, it has to be preserved. But if it's a new buffer that's being planted, that has to be planted before the first building permit in that phase. And then they can't move on to another phase until that buffer is planted as well. And then on the back end, there's a 2-year guarantee period after substantial completion is issued for that phase. So unlike what we see now, it really stretches out the time period that the trees are in the ground and growing before the developer is done and the guarantees and bonding is out of the picture. So the trees will be planted before the first building permit in that phase. Then all the roads and stuff go in, the houses all get built. Then, when that's all done, they're going to come back to the county to get a substantial completion sign-off, and that might likely take a year or more just to get from point A to point B there, and then that starts the 2-year guarantee with the bonding that remains in place. So, we'll get the trees in earlier, and they'll be protected longer, basically, through this ordinance. So, that's a general overview of it. The ordinance is page-wise, it's, I think, 25 pages long. That's because we deleted all the current definitions. We added that new section. And then, as I mentioned in the cover memo, the reference to vegetated buffer or perimeter buffer sort of are sprinkled throughout the code. For example, they're in our SCRP requirements. And so every time that was mentioned, we had to pull that in. The other thing I do want to just remind everybody, this applies to subdivisions and it applies to RPCs. But like our prior buffers, it also can apply to residential conditional uses. That's actually the very last section in here. So as you know, with a residential conditional use, we have the ability to impose conditions. The code specifically says that this is one of them. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm willing to go into more detail, but we have talked about this at length. Mr. Whitehouse did provide some slides. This is the example of the perimeter buffer where there is existing woodlands, and that's sort of the darker shaded green. And you can see that's 30 feet wide, and then there would be the 20-foot minimum perimeter buffer protection area. Beyond that is, as I mentioned, the silt facing. And then we have signage at 100-foot intervals. The reason we did that at that distance is that way in a cluster subdivision, somebody would always see a sign no matter where your lot is. We didn't want to make it too large, but we didn't want to make it overburdensome and too small. And the other thing I should add, which kind of shows up here, this is actually a fairly standard representation of a subdivision, because we don't usually have linear streets. So the lots sort of generally curve around what is the perimeter of the property. But the perimeter buffer and the perimeter buffer protection area still counts towards your open space calculations for a subdivision. So there's no penalty there in terms of open space. And with the cluster subdivisions, we're running at about 45 to 50% open space generally, I think, Mr. Whitehouse, would you say? Yeah. So, that's not a fine line that we're, kind of shading towards with the open space. I think we're in good shape with that. So.
Can I ask a question about this slide?
Certainly. You back up
Slide
10
that was
minutes.
just up there.
Oh.
I had asked this question, and I think I remember the answer you gave. So the extra 20-foot protection area, did that have the effect of creating an additional setback of the lot, the building envelope, or not the building envelope, the lot line, the rear yard lot line? Did that push the design that they had to move that additional 20 feet away from the perimeter buffer in dark green?
Yes.
Is that what the net effect was?
Yeah. So, well, however you want to call it, you can't have any lot lines within that perimeter buffer area. So, depending on the design of the property, that lot line is going to be outside of that.
So by creating the protection area, you in effect move the lots further away from the protected buffer.
That's correct.
What the net effect is?
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
yeah. So I guess and I don't know if this is the direction you're going with this, but a couple of things we looked at early on this is, one, when construction's happening, we'd get contractors that were disturbing the wooded buffer areas, and so that perimeter buffer protection area is designed to create more separation between, the big front end loaders or whatever that they're doing site work with and the trees. So that's one part of it. The other part, I don't know if Mr. Lawson or Mr. Whitehouse had the slides where the lots were creeping into the buffer areas also. So that buffer area actually creates a bigger separation between those lots and the trees you want to preserve.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I have another question.
Schaefer.
Has there been any more thought giving to the issue that we've been, particularly Mr. Whitehouse and I have been in Tidewater Landing? We have a community that's being built over a number of years, and we still don't have buffers in. Has there been any more consideration to help address that issue?
I'm happy to assist that one. So the wording of this ordinance actually caters for that scenario by adding greater precision as to when buffers are to be delivered, and also it has enhanced enforcement measures and protections. So in the drafting of this, we've catered for that. So.
Yeah, that was actually kind of that's under the current requirements, but that was actually a good tool to look at how do we avoid that happening again. So this ordinance takes care of that.
Any more questions? You want to read your short title? Or Mr. Moore,
that's short, but
you can read your title.
Because it does touch on a lot of sections. It's an ordinance to amend Chapter 99, Articles 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, Sections 99-5, 99-6, 99-23, 99-26, 99-27, 99-30, 99-31, and 99-32, and by adding a new Section 99-21A and Chapter 115, Articles 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 28, Sections 115-20, 115-25, 115-29, 115-37, 115-45, 115-53, and 115-28 regarding perimeter buffers around residential development.
You sure you got all your sections there you wanted?
I hope so, yeah.
Anybody want to introduce this ordinance?
No, I'll introduce it.
Mr. Riley, introduce the ordinance.
And as we said, that gets us on the calendar for planning and zoning first, and then also, obviously, you all, once we have a recommendation for planning and zoning.
Thank you for all your work on this.
Yeah, good work. Thank you.